Welcome to The Debate. We are diving today into, I think, one of the most compelling paradoxes presented in our source material, the antenna of the individual mind, the fundamental source of creative insight. We're talking about that moment of breakthrough, that sudden flash of genius.
It is a profound tension, isn't it? Because on one side, we have these measurable neuroscientific observations of the creative state, and then on the other, this deeply ingrained subjective experience of the creator themselves.
And that tension perfectly frames our central question. The material notes that creative insights, they frequently emerge during these diffuse attention states. Those low-focus moments like walking or showering or just zoning out. So here's the hinge point. Is creativity fundamentally a process of the individual brain making novel connections based purely on its existing internal data? Or is the mind functioning more like an instrument tuning into information that exists independently of that individual brain?
And I maintain that the overwhelming descriptive testimony of creators, which is supported by how our brains appear to optimize themselves, it really forces us toward the latter. I'm going to argue that the mind is an antenna, and the creative act is fundamentally one of reception, not internal fabrication.
And I, conversely, will argue that the neuroscientific evidence provides a complete and a much more parsimonious explanation for the phenomenon entirely within the boundaries of the individual skull. Creativity is an internal process of synthesis, and those diffuse attention states are simply the necessary cognitive conditions for that synthesis to occur. Position statements. So my position is really grounded in the functional architecture of the brain. Creative insight is, I believe, purely a function of the individual brain's internal structure and its specific history of acquired knowledge. The material's observation that insight correlates specifically with diffuse attention states, well, that's the smoking gun for an internal mechanism. This state isn't random, it's a measurable cognitive shift, and I'd say it's designed to maximize internal exploration.
But you're jumping ahead to the mechanism without sufficiently questioning the source.
Well, I think the mechanism defines the source. When the brain shifts from, say, high-focus executive function, the task-positive network, it measurably decreases the activity of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the DLFPC. Now, this region normally imposes this very strict top-down inhibitory control over semantic pathways. By suppressing the DLFPC, the brain allows the default mode network, or DMN, to increase spontaneous associations between very distant memory nodes. This is the brain actively, unconsciously, reorganizing its own pre-existing knowledge into novel structures. It's a computational process. No external retrieval is necessary to explain the novelty.
I come at it from a different way. While yes, the shift into the DMN state is certainly the neurological condition under which insight is experienced, I fundamentally reject that this shift confirms the source is internal. My core argument is that the individual mind functions as an antenna, one that's optimized for reception rather than internal rearrangement. We can't simply dismiss the subjective testimony cited in our source material.
The artist's testimony.
It is. Consider the common phenomenology. Artists, composers, inventors throughout history, they use this language of receiving their work. They claim it spoke through them, or it arrived fully formed, or that they were just a secretary documenting the material. Now, if creation were purely an internal connection-making process, just the reorganization of data points unique to their internal history, the feeling should be one of intense, though maybe unconscious, problem-solving, like solving a complex hidden equation.
It is solving a hidden equation.
But the subjective experience suggests the coherence and the material itself. It often feels alien to their immediate conscious history. It coheres outside their volitional control. So the diffuse attention state, therefore, isn't a factory floor for internal manufacturing. It's simply the optimal neurological tuning state, a quieter, less cluttered channel necessary to receive the signal originating independently of the individual.
Okay, look, I agree that the role of diffuse attention is the hinge point here, but I worry you are misinterpreting the function of that state. You describe the diffuse state as this passive reception, a quiet channel. I argue it's an active internal reorganization. The entire purpose of the DMN taking over when the DLPFC steps down is to execute this high-level recombination of semantic and episodic memory networks.
But why is that recombination necessary?
Because creative insight requires breaking fixedness. When the brain is focused, it strengthens established pathways. To achieve true novelty, you have to allow those distant, inhibited pathways to connect. The DMN state is the brain providing itself the opportunity to actively, though unconsciously, reorganizing its own massive data set. I mean, if you accept that the brain is a powerful associative engine, then the observed state is perfectly explained as the engine turning on its novelty generation protocol. This all remains fundamentally the individual brain synthesizing novelty from within its own boundaries.
All concede that the brain is the required hardware for processing and articulation. It's the decoding machine. But the fact that the DMN is highly active could just as easily be interpreted as the brain's shifting into the optimal state for decoding information that isn't stored locally. Think of the brain's internal data as noise. A mind consumed by a specific task is deafened by that noise. If the creative information is subtle, a high-fidelity pattern existing independently, the DMN state clears the local traffic, which allows the brain to devote resources to processing the received, low-signal input. The neurological shift is toward tuning, not necessarily fabricating. And this brings us back to the most critical point, reconciling the description of reception with the empirical observations. We have to resist labeling consistent human experience across millennia as merely an interesting byproduct. If the feeling of reception is just a psychological byproduct of highly complex, unconscious processing, why doesn't this external feeling manifest consistently across all complex, unconscious processes?
That's an excellent challenge.
I mean, consider predictive motor skills. We generate complex, non-conscious motor plans thousands of times a day. We don't feel like some external force is guiding our hand as we catch a ball, or rapid calculation. A mathematician might solve a complex function unconsciously, but the insight feels like an internal solution, even if it was rapid and outside conscious awareness. So why is the external received phenomenology reserved almost exclusively for novelty, for the true creative breakthrough?
I believe the distinction lies precisely in the quality of the internal output. You are right that non-conscious motor and calculation processes are efficient and often hidden from consciousness, but their output is usually highly predictable, or it's constrained by established algorithms. They don't yield truly novel coherence. The creative insight generated in the DMN state is, by definition, an unexpected recombination, yielding a pattern the conscious mind did not anticipate and could not logically reconstruct.
So the feeling of external origin is just a measure of internal surprise.
Exactly. The sense of it being received is the conscious self attempting to integrate an insight that bypasses the normal mechanisms of conscious effort and logical assembly. Because it appears fully formed and utterly unpredictable, the conscious mind reasonably concludes, I didn't make that. But the lack of conscious authorship is not proof of an external source. It's proof of successful hidden internal reorganization. The brain, the generator, has simply fooled the conscious self into thinking the work came from outside. Now, let's be rigorous about this. If we are to accept creativity as independent reception, we need to move beyond the subjective experience and provide a clear, coherent conceptual framework for what information that exists independent of the individual mind even means. Where is this information? How does it persist? If we cannot conceptually substantiate it beyond, just the artist's compelling feeling, then the internal connection-making model remains the stronger, more parsimonious explanation. It relies only on measurable neurological processes and internal memory storage.
I appreciate the demand for rigor, and I understand why the internal model seems more parsimonious under a strict physicalist interpretation of consciousness. However, the requirement that the information must be empirically located is precisely where the traditional model fails to account for the depth of the phenomenon. I'm not suggesting the information is floating in the air. I am suggesting its source is non-local to the individual brain.
Define non-local in this context.
Non-local or independent means the information, the coherence, or the pattern is not solely derived from the specific, idiosyncratic, accumulated history of the person receiving it. Think of Jungian archetypes or a shared human knowledge field, accessible by all, yet articulated uniquely by each individual brain. When a creator, like Samuel Taylor Coleridge describing Kubla Khan, says the poem arrived as a complete, fully formed vision, it points toward access to a coherence that transcends his specific accumulated vocabulary and experiences.
That sounds highly metaphysical. How does the antenna mechanism work in that framework?
The brain, the antenna, acts as a decoding apparatus. It is the filter and the translator. The independent information exists as patterns or frequencies, some kind of universal coherence. The diffuse state, that lowered cognitive control, it isn't generating the pattern, it's adjusting the dial on the radio, enabling the brain to resonate with a frequency it normally filters out. The individual's history then shapes the output. So Mozart hears the symphony, Einstein sees the physics, but the core transcendent coherence originates elsewhere. The universality of profound creative works suggests their patterns were not invented, but discovered, tuned into.
But any complex computation, drawing on the entire semantic and episodic database of a genius like Mozart, would feel universal simply because that brain has integrated a lifetime of universal musical structure. We are still comparing an internally generated, highly complex novelty against a subjectively compelling but ultimately unproven external signal. The DMN's known function is recombination. To assert an independent source requires providing a stronger link than just the difficulty of explaining genius.
I don't disagree that the DMN recombines data, but the distinction is crucial. Does the DMN generate the coherence from noise, or does it decode an existing coherence into the individual's language? I argue that the profound nature of true creative insight, the way it resonates across time and culture, suggests that the information contains more coherence than could be synthesized purely from the localized individual experience. The antenna model simply provides a mechanism for accessing those shared, independent patterns.
And I still see the antenna analogy as an elegant description of an internal process the conscious mind cannot access, rather than an accurate model of external reception. The brain is the entire system, the transmitter, receiver, and generator all in one. Conclusion: ultimately, the strength of the internal generation position rests on the observed neurological mechanism. The shift to diffuse attention states is demonstrably linked to the necessary cognitive function, the suppression of inhibitory control that's required for the individual brain to recombine its vast internal database into novel forms. And while the subjective feeling of reception is powerful, I think it is best understood as a psychological byproduct of this unconscious and highly effective internal connection-making process. The engine is within.
And I would reaffirm the necessity of integrating the two lines of evidence. To dismiss the consistent subjective claims of reception because the source resists current empirical location is to ignore half the data provided in the antenna of the individual mind. Both the descriptive claims of artists and the measurable neurological states are entirely consistent with the view of the individual mind functioning primarily as an antenna, one optimized in diffuse states, to tune into independent information coherence that transcends the individual's localized history.
We both observe the same phenomena, the moment of breakthrough, the shift in brain state, but we arrive at vastly different conclusions regarding the boundaries of the individual mind and the very definition of novelty itself.
Indeed, and it underscores the inherent difficulty in definitively drawing the line between internal synthesis and external discovery when we're studying the human creative mind. It suggests that our definition of knowledge and where information resides is still very much open for rigorous exploration.